everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Jews on Film, where we are excited to bring you a guest episode where Harry and I had the opportunity to sit down with the folks from the Deadbeat Film Society, a local Seattle, Washington podcast, where we discussed the film Rain Man. Harry, what'd you think?
I loved Rain Man, and I loved being a guest on a podcast for once. It was nice, to sort of not be the ones, running the show, to just kind of sit back, let them dictate how it went. But then something I was really excited about was just getting to watch a movie for once and not have to bring on the Jewish lens, just kind of talk about it as is, which is not to say that I don't love the experiment we do here on Jews on Film. It's great to get back into the groove of things and talk about the Jewishness and pull our stretches out. And I'm really enjoying that too. But for 1 week, It was a nice little break. Did you enjoy that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a fun time. Thank you to Emily and Kevin for having us on the Deadbeat Film Society. So enjoy this special episode of the Deadbeat Film Society featuring us, and make sure to check out their podcast, Deadbeat Film Society, on Twitter and wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy the show.
Kmart sucks.
Hello and welcome. We are the Deadbeat Film Society. Each episode, we talk about one important film. Today's film is Rain Man from 1988. I am Emily.
Oh, hi, I'm Kevin. Welcome, Deadbeats. Let me tell you why Rain Man's important, as if you didn't know. First of all, a ton of Academy Awards. It was nominated for 8 Oscars. All the big ones, and it actually won. I feel like we went on a string where movies were nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards that we've been talking about, but then they didn't actually won. This one won. It won Best Picture, and it won Best Director and Best Actor for Tom Cruise. Just kidding, Dustin Hoffman. And it also won Best Screenplay. Pretty big deal. Along with that, it made $355 million on a budget of $25 million. It was the highest grossing film of 1988, which is not insignificant. Although I did want to look this up. We just recently talked about Black Swan, and I feel like Black Swan made the same amount of money. It made $329 million, and this movie made $355 million. And I get it. It was 80s to now. But if you think about the fact that, maybe more people are going to movies. I don't know. I just think it's really fantastic that Black Swan made that much money, and maybe the numbers sometimes get lost in the shuffle. But this movie was the highest grossing film in 1988. Along with that, it stars a very young Tom Cruise. I think he's like 26 or something in this movie. Tom Cruise looking like a straight up baby in this movie, and I was really happy about it. Also, Dustin Hoffman, very famously playing the autistic savant character. He won the Academy Award for this performance. What else? It got a score by Hans Zimmer. I think this was like his first kind of solo score. It's pretty interesting. He goes on to become super famous. He did a bunch of stuff with Disney. I think maybe most famously, or the one that launched him, was The Lion King. And then he does Pirates of the Caribbean, and also all the Inception and all those kinds of movies with what's his face. So he's a pretty big deal in sort of modern composing, whatever, movie scores, Hans Zimmer. And then lastly, it has an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes, which I think is interesting. My favorite movies are usually in the 80s, and I think they're kind of the best. If a movie's in the high 90s, I always get a little dubious that it's actually good. But 89%, pretty good. Let's talk about it. Rain Man, it's super famous. You know about it. Here today to talk about us is the hosts of the fantastic Jews on Film podcast. We have Daniel and Harry. Welcome, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming on and for picking Rain Man. I actually enjoyed watching this movie. Emily, did you as well?
I did.
Yeah, I feel like we went through a big run of tough to watch movies, and it feels like a really nice palate cleanser to be able to enjoy I don't know, average American comedy drama. So first, thank you for that. Why'd you guys pick it? I sent you a big list, and I think I sent you a list, and I don't know, you guys were just immediately Rain Man's the one.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, our podcast, Jews on Film, we talk about films that may or may not have explicit Jewish content or not so explicit Jewish content. And we picked we previously did another Barry Levinson movie that just came out called The Survivor, about a Holocaust survivor who flashes back and is boxing other Jews. And anyway, so that was another Barry Levinson film we did. Also, Dustin Hoffman is, great actor, also a Jew. So That one stuck out to me. I don't know. What about you, Harry?
I mean, for me, I had actually never seen Rain Man, and was kind of excited to have an excuse to see it and just enjoy it. And I'll say at the top, it was very different than I expected, and I enjoyed it in ways that I didn't expect to enjoy it. Kind of what I had thought it was from, just its presence in pop culture, I guess, until I had actually seen it.
Yes, that is super interesting to me. I feel like Rain Man, that sort of like character that he does, gets parodied a ton, referenced a ton. It, like on the Wikipedia page, it's like references at the bottom, and there's like this huge list of movies that sort of like reference Rain Man. I feel like even just like the name Rain Man kind of went into popular culture as sort of a term you would use for somebody who has like special math powers or memory powers or whatever.
Also, like,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's worth pointing out like the late 80s, 90s had like a very different attitude towards mental health. I feel like, the words that, Tom Cruise calling his brother the R word, I feel like, just in general, like awareness of autism was not as prevalent as it was, or it's not as, it wasn't as prevalent back then. So to have this film kind of be the sort of autism film and to have it star such huge actors, I feel like is, it's a pretty big deal.
Oh, absolutely. Regard. Yeah. For sure. And I think, we can kind of dive into like the story and the content and stuff, but I think the general consensus is that they did a pretty good job, which is like not the case at all for 80s and 90s movies.
No.
They're pretty cringy. We've gone back and watched a few that are really tough. But I think it's super interesting, the idea of like these huge movies that are so ubiquitous in American pop culture, and to be like, somehow not seeing them and to kind of come into it is super interesting to me. I think that's happened to Emily a few times.
All of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we started doing this, I hadn't seen any of the like important big movies. So
I mean, it's kind of nice to come into it sort of with a little bit of hype, but like I feel like maybe I saw this as a kid, but it's been a while, and like certainly as an adult, I have a greater appreciation for it.
Well, it's interesting because some of them, like The Godfather, I'd seen that character so many times that I was like, okay, I didn't really need to watch this. But some of them, like Rocky, I assumed I would hate it, and I really liked it. And this was one where I thought it was going to be more Forrest Gumpy, where you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. But it was actually very good and heartfelt and well done and more balanced. So that surprised me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with your comparison to Forrest Gump, where you're saying that it's not the same, because I expected it to be much more sort of like sweet and saccharine. And like I was waiting for the Tom Cruise character to just sort of learn his lesson and kind of like soften up. And that really doesn't happen until the very, very end of the movie. And you could even debatably say that he doesn't fully come around by the end. He doesn't learn his lesson in that traditional way. And that's really what surprised me about it.
And it definitely ends sort of open-ended, where he like puts him back in the train. And he's like, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. But you're like, well, maybe he does, or maybe he just goes back to cocaine and selling Ferraris on the black
market. Maybe he'll visit him once, and then, who knows how often he's going to come back after that.
Yeah. But I think that's really interesting. I think that's true. Like it's weird because this is sort of the tail end of the 80s where they start really laying on the saccharine 90s, where it's just like every single movie has to have this like big sort of bow tied up on it, and you have to they're going to tell you exactly how you're supposed to feel about this movie. And I blame a lot of that on Steven Spielberg, who kind of like sort of, I don't want to say invented it, but really made it a cash cow. And so everybody started kind of copying that model of nostalgia and sort of like sentimentality that we really get through 90s movies. And so if it had maybe come out 5 years later, it would have been really kind of a lot, maybe like a less important of a film, or at least less well done. I also think it's interesting about Dan, you were mentioning kind of the portrayal of autism on screen is maybe this kind of like, I feel like this is kind of maybe the first, or at least certainly the biggest. And then after this, you get this big wave, like to the point where it was almost a parody of major actors going for characters with disabilities. And to a certain extent, you can say like, hey, this is super interesting because we're starting to finally get the diversity of like the human spectrum shown on film. We talked about Coda winning. Here on this podcast, we talked about Coda, about a deaf family. And the idea about getting these stories out there to give awareness to people, because I think, like, for better or for worse, most people like the way that we understand or even learn, especially in modern times, is through media. And movies can be a really, really great teaching tool. I mean, if this is your experience and you want to be able to, like the deaf experience, you can learn so much about the deaf community and what it means to be deaf from Coda. However, like, with that, there's a lot of problematic things that can happen because, in the wrong hands, they can put the wrong information out there, and then you've just sort of solidified who they are. And I think that this film kind of went both ways. From what I could research, like, most people were really, really happy with the fact that, like, finally autism is out in the public lexicon. People are actually saying the word autistic before, like you were saying, they would use a hard R word. And that I actually looked this up, that charitable donations to medical research and autism awareness like went up tenfold after this movie came out, that people were really becoming aware of it. However, on the other side of things, it kind of like blended, because he's like an autistic and a savant. And so everyone's just like, oh, you're autistic, you must be good at math. Right. It kind of like blended those two together, and it made people sort of feel like there's sort of like this magicalness to it, that's sort of like, hey, if you're autistic, you've got this like power that you just need to like unlock, and you can like wow people and win friends and relationships through this. Where it, to a certain extent, I actually had to look up the statistic because I was interested in this. 37% of autistics are savants. So, I mean, that's pretty small.
That's higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah. But still, I mean,
yeah,
of the autistics that you're going to encounter in life, only 30% of them are going to be savants. Yeah. It kind of makes it more difficult when you sort of assume that, like, oh, you just need to unlock your superpower and then you'll be normal again.
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of we've seen a wave of media in the last, I don't know, like 5 years that has really featured like a range of stories of autism. And I think that more recently hasn't specifically focused on the savant. And so maybe that's where I'm thinking that assumption comes from. But it seems, I don't know anyone. Do we still say autism spectrum?
Yeah, you say like on the spectrum, okay. I think probably.
Sometimes.
I think, I don't know. I mean,
okay. Yeah. So I don't have any personal relationships with anybody on the autism spectrum, and I will find out if that is the currently preferred terminology. I should have looked that up. But it seems like it's a range, like spectrum feels appropriate because each person's individual experience seems very varied. And I don't think I really had an understanding of that until very recently.
Yeah. I wanted to point out that the writer the person, so the screenplay was written by, according to Wikipedia, Barry Morrow and Ronald Bass. And then, so Barry Morrow, like, he was inspired by two sort of well-known savant characters of the time. One was called Bill Sachter, and the other one was called Kim Peek. And Kim Peek was one of these savant type folks who could literally read a book in an hour, and with one eye, with his left eye, could read the left side of the page, and with his right eye could read the right side of the page. And he could do amazing things like that, which is what you were talking about, Kevin, with this sort of like magical ability. But in the other hand, there were other tasks such as like tying his shoes or something like that were where he was not able to do. And I feel like they sort of portrayed that with Raymond, where he's like, not sure how to pay for things. And, when the doctor is asking him these sort of basic questions, he's able to calculate all these numbers. But then, how many, he asked him some question about like, making change or how much does something cost. And he's just like,
everything's $100. It's like Lucille Bluth, where he's like, how much does a banana cost? And he's like, $100.
Right. Yeah, definitely $100.
I want to jump in on what you were saying, Kevin, the comparison you were making to Coda, because I think that's actually a really interesting one, because, Coda is a film about a deaf family, and the way that was cast, it was cast with deaf actors. And you kind of imagine if they were doing Rain Man today, they probably wouldn't have cast it with, Dustin Hoffman, someone who's not on the autistic spectrum. And it's such an interesting lens, because on one hand, it's like, he's, I know that's a big big issue, casting people that are not necessarily in the same disability that's being represented. But I don't think that necessarily means that performance was necessarily a harmful one. I think you were talking about how it raised a lot of awareness and how it was actually, it was a good representation of this person. And I do think that if you sort of watch the movie, like part of what I was expecting in the sort of saccharine mold of what I expected was that he would all of a sudden become, he'd be willing to hug his brother, and he would, kind of turn around and learn to be more, quote unquote, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And even through that last scene when he's getting on the train, he doesn't give the sweet goodbye to, his brother Charlie. He just kind of goes about the world the way he always did. And I think that touch just made it feel much more grounded, and like it wasn't trying to tidy up, the story of someone suffering from autism, but it really was just, it as far as I could tell, it was a very fair representation, even though Dustin Hoffman wasn't himself an autistic.
I thought about this a lot, actually, because most of the films from this time period and even now, it is an issue of representation where we're like, well, why didn't you get a gay actor? Why didn't you get an Asian American actor? Or all of the different types of people. It's just like, we're not casting the appropriate people. But I was thinking about this, and maybe it's because they specifically explain that he doesn't understand money, and that his interactions are more internalized. I was thinking if you were to cast somebody specifically like a savant, would they be in a position to understand acting, or would it be exploitative? And that's what I couldn't not to assume that he's like a child, but I recently was watching a show where there was a child actor who didn't understand what acting was and expected the person to be. I was watching
The Rehearsal.
Yeah, The Rehearsal.
Love that
I watched
show.
that last night, and the kid doesn't have a dad and thinks that he's his dad. And it's because he doesn't have a concept of what acting is. He's too young.
Okay.
And so because I happened to see that, I was thinking about that while I was watching this, would an actor, obviously it's a spectrum. And so there could be people that have autism that could play this role, but at this specific presentation of autism, would they be able to act in a way where it would be I don't know, not an exploitation thing?
That's super interesting.
And I can't stop thinking about it.
I don't want to tip my recommendation, so maybe I'll burn it and I'll use a different recommendation. But there's a show on Amazon Prime called As We See It, and it's all about folks who have autism, and I think the three different characters in the show, they live in a group home and things like that, and they're all on the spectrum in real life. And I think, obviously their portrayals are a little bit heightened for dramatic effect and things like that, but they all vary in terms of how, because it's like you said, it's on the spectrum. So, one person is, unable to even go outside because of sound things, and it's too much for them. And the other person can't read social, and social cues, and is just very flat with their affect and things like that. So I think it does kind of range, but I would recommend that, again, sorry to burn my recommendation.
No, I mean, it's
I thought it was relevant to the discussion because it was a really cool introduction to that world, and I'd highly recommend it. Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right. I think along with that, sort of the main characteristics, I understand it with autism is, like you mentioned, they have extreme sensitivity to sensory stimuli. A lot of S's, just they become very overloaded by loud. So I imagine on a set with a lot of lights, a lot of people, a lot of sound, constant stopping, starting is going to set off those triggers. And then on top of that, just sort of difficulty in social situations. I think one of the great examples that I saw when I was researching, actually I was researching that Kim Peek guy, was they can understand the sort of human based emotions like happy and sad. And so they experience happiness and joy, and they experience sadness. The things that they don't necessarily understand or perceive well is when it's based around social interaction. So things like pride or embarrassment they don't get because it's related to social cues. It's not sort of innate, if that makes sense. And so a lot of that stuff might be really difficult to act, although it's not my place to say. Like you said, it's spectrum. Maybe they could have found it. I think the difficulty is just would the performance be better and or the same? I mean, he won an Oscar for it, so let's say it's a great performance. Or would it just make us feel better about this? And I think
it's a good question.
Extent, is it would along with that, would it heighten sort of the community and make it better? or and in hand with that is this movie and this performance by Dustin Hoffman making it worse. And I think like the evidence here, having given the last whatever it is 25, 30 years, is clearly that it overall it did well for the community. It brought a lot of awareness and a lot of helpful assets in the way of money.
Yeah.
But a lot of communities, like we've talked about in the past, especially like racial minorities, have a really hard time getting work, can do the work, and yet continuously get overcasted by like white people.
It's also interesting. I mean, like you can't act Asian American.
Yeah.
But
Mickey Rooney and Breakfast at Tiffany's.
But in this, I mean, it's like, I guess this is kind of a classic example of like what really good acting is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if anyone's going to do it, Dustin Hoffman, he's a method actor.
Yeah.
He obsessively followed around. He actually went and found this Kim Peek guy and spent time with him, obsessively like monitoring. He read a bunch of stuff with him. And this Kim Peek guy was super fascinating. I was reading about him quite a bit. He actually like was pretty high functioning. And after this, he started getting calls for a lot of like appearances and to kind of do like some special speaking engagements. I would assume like a lot of like autism awareness kind of bloomed after this. And so he kind of became a spokesperson. And the screenwriter, Barry Morrow, gave him the Oscar that he won for it. And so it kind of became this famous Oscar that Kim Peek would carry around with him. And whenever he would do these sort of appearances, everyone, and it created a lot of joy. And so you got to imagine that like this movie overwhelmingly creates all this connection for a community that, maybe wouldn't even have seen the light of day for who knows how long, would have still been kind of under an umbrella of just like disabled, quote unquote.
Right.
So kind of super interesting. And again, Dustin Hoffman, like I said, sort of clearly a great actor. We've talked about him in the past. We covered Tootsie, which we didn't like so much, and The Graduate, which we did like. But certainly, I mean, he's been nominated for Academy Awards in the past, and he's clearly one of the great American actors. And like I mentioned, he's a method actor, so he kind of goes in deep and becomes that character. So
we had one guest in that.
We had like Sean Penn, right? In I Am Sam, or some of these other ones that made attempts after the fact. I mean, you mentioned Tom Hanks. We talked a lot about whether or not Tom Hanks is really doing disservice. I think the general consensus is yes, but it is interesting.
It almost like parodied itself in like Tropic Thunder. Do you remember that scene?
Where, absolutely.
Where Ben Stiller goes, full R. It's just like, I think, they sort of picked up on that trend that like these prestige actors are trying to do these like sort of, outshine Rain Man. But I think, this was a nice, I felt like it was a nice portrayal, very sympathetic portrayal of someone, what it's like to live with like mental illness or not, to be on, So, what it's like to live with, someone who's on the spectrum and how that impacts that person and the caregivers. And
totally.
I do think that part of the story was super interesting because, to a certain extent, like which one is he? Raymond, Dustin Hoffman's character, he's not really like super affected. Like he's just kind of going about his life the way this is really like Tom Cruise's story. And so you mentioned the caregivers. I feel like to me, this is a caregiver movie and about how it's not just raising awareness about autism and what autism might actually be like, but a lot of it is like the storyline is like how much work and how much need these people require in order to just sort of like function and be comfortable, I guess I should say. And that because of sort of like their quote unquote special needs, that, a lot of the, like I mentioned, the sensory stimuli, their routines, their habits and things like that, the caregiving is very specialized. And I think that is sort of the story of this movie is like whether or not Tom Cruise, and, we can put Tom Cruise's cipher, whether or not any of us could be the ones to like take care of someone like this and maybe like double down on sort of like the effort and appreciation for the people that do take their time to take care of people.
I thought it was interesting too. Part of Tom Cruise's argument for why he should have custody over his brother is that he's capable. He can do things that he like never had a chance to do, and he could. And I mean, it's arguable whether his like negative experience with the smoke alarm is more damaging than his positive experience learning how to dance. Who can say?
Right.
But like, I thought that was really interesting to have this, like, I think in my super positive open ending, his brother goes to visit him frequently and like takes him out, and he has this like new, slightly more exploratory part of his life where he gets to like have some new experiences that are within, what's safe for him. And I thought that was really interesting, that it is like he cannot live with his brother, but if he tries new things, he's pretty successful at them.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Given the opportunity, he could do more. And I think this is where I think about this sometimes. The idea that like, this is our interpretation of what like a better life is, right? That like, Raymond just sitting in the home every single day, watching Wapner and like eating the same food, to us is an unhappy life. And so, and obviously within the movie, to Tom Cruise, it's an unhappy life. And so that he needs to get out and he needs to experience life. He needs to dance in an elevator. He needs to go across country. He needs to do all of these wonderful experiences and experience what life has to offer in order to really live a full and rich life. But like, is that true? Or is that just us saying like, this is what is required in order to enjoy your life? Because, and again, I think that's kind of an American thing, that like, if you just spend all day watching TV, that you're somehow like not living a worthy life, right?
That's my life.
You're supposed to be working, and like when you go on vacation, you're supposed to also be doing things.
I think that's a big part of Dustin Hoffman's performance. Like, I really don't think he ever lets on, if this really positively impacted him. And by the end of it, you don't get the sense, like, I think there's that moment where he kind of learns that the routine he's been doing, the who's on first, is like a joke, and he kind of, you have that scene at the diner where he says like, oh, Charlie made a joke, and you kind of get a little bit of a perspective shift. But again, the reason I love that last scene so much is that we just don't know, like the exact question you're asking, is this really a better life for him? Was he happy, or does he need these life experiences? Like the movie makes a point to say we don't actually have such a strong window into his life and into his perspective on all this. And that's why I think if Tom Cruise had won, if Charlie Babbitt had won custody and kind of said, I'm taking this guy, like, that's not the happy ending to me, because I don't like, we've seen the recklessness of that. We've seen all the negative things that can come out of that, but has the movie really made a case for just how positive and how transformative it is? Like, I don't really think
it almost seems like it would be positive for Tom Cruise. He's clearly become a better person.
Sure.
I 100% agree with you that this movie is about Tom Cruise's Charlie's character, his growth and his learning what that means to take care of himself, take care of someone else, and have a family and come to terms with a family that he hated and felt alienated from. And it's all his change. And as much like Dustin Hoffman, he won the Oscar for it. It's an incredible performance, but and partly because this is the role, it's very one note. He's playing the exact same note the entire time, and
he's literally saying the same things over and over again.
I mean, literally, like he's not the one who's doing the traditional sort of journey and growth like that. Sure. That's all Tom Cruise's character.
I think it's like a measured difference, right? Tom Cruise has like the biggest swing from being like super self-involved and only thinking about himself and his Lamborghinis and not even like caring about his girlfriend or whatever. But then by the end, he, you could argue that he does care about Raymond a little bit. I think Dustin Hoffman like makes a change from like here to here. It's not such a huge difference, but I think for him in this film, in this world, I think, like you said, Harry, the jokes that he's making and the sort of, the learning to dance, the kissing people, and I think it's a big change for him in his world where he's used to like, watching Wapner and having Jell-O every night and that kind of thing. So
but I think the pivotal scene too is when the doctor is sort of grilling or interrogating him to decide, like, do you want to stay with your brother Charlie, or do you want to go back to the home? And he just says, yeah to every question. He's like, do you want to go with Charlie? Yeah. Are you sure you want to go with Charlie? Yeah. Do you want to go back to the home? Yeah. It's like, I think clearly, this is the big emotional crux of the film, and we're supposed to feel really like this soaring relief, like, oh, he wants to stay with his brother. And then we realize like, oh, he's not capable of making a decision. And that to me, it's like, you're supposed to feel like, oh man, I feel bad for Charlie that he's not going to be able to get to his brother. But at the same time, kind of with what you guys are talking about, Dustin Hoffman's character never lets on whether he even really wants to go back to the home, because it's not like he desperately can't wait to get back to the home. He's sort of saying yes to both things. He doesn't have that awareness. I think, he now has these memories. Clearly, he mentions the memories of his father a lot. He's constantly talking about how his dad would come and visit him and he would drive in the car and drive around the driveway. And so you got to imagine that now he's going to be repeating to everybody the adventure that he had with Charlie. And so it's clear that like these types of memories and a connection with a family has been really important to him. He's very aware that Charlie is his brother. I mean, he's telling him stories about his past and stuff. So, you would imagine that overall it's a positive experience, but I do think it is interesting kind of the type what you guys were both saying is that like these experiences are almost kind of both the same. Yeah. To both. And that, he isn't super excited about one or the other.
Yeah. It's like he takes 2 steps forward, in his progression, Raymond does. And then every time we see some sort of growth, whether it's dancing or whatnot, you do have a scene where someone checks in with him and you do realize that like, oh, wait, as much as we feel like we're making progress, he still doesn't know, about smoke alarms or about.
Oh, that's a good point. I think that might be the 90s thing. That's the thing that they're missing. So, you've got the dancing in the elevator thing, but he does get the one step back where once he goes back to the hotel, things kind of like revert back to him a little bit. And I think in the 90s, they wouldn't have that pull back. You would just continuously progress, as you went forward.
I think the same is true for Charlie's character. You talked about the scene with the lawyer, and that's really my favorite scene. And I only learned afterwards that the lawyer is played by Barry Levinson, which
nice.
I had no idea about. I just heard about that in like a different podcast. And what I just think is so great about that scene is that even the way you're talking about, the Raymond and that he's sort of taking a step back when you think he's grown. I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing with Charlie. We've gotten to this point where it's like Charlie's going to like fight for Raymond. He's going to win the case. He's going to become this, great guardian. And all of a sudden in that scene, like I was very much sympathetic to the lawyer in that scene because he's like, I'm not trying to antagonize you. I'm just trying to ask you questions. Stop being so defensive. But you see it. Charlie's like getting very defensive and very protective. And it's very clear that as much as he's grown, so to speak, he's not yet ready to take care of this person. He still has his sort of selfish tendencies. I'm sure he still is thinking about the money and what that would mean to get, ownership. And he's not really thinking about Raymond as a person and what's best for him, because the same way all of us were able to read, maybe what's best for Raymond is to live in a place where he has, routine and schedule. Like Charlie is just so blind to that because he just feels like I finally have a brother. It's a better selfish pursuit. It's not just for the money, but it still is a selfish pursuit of absolutely. I need my brother. I want to have the family I always wanted. And I just love that that's like the climactic scene because it really is this like, let's take a step back. Like you think he's come this long way and he has, but it's not so simple. The answer isn't just put him into Charlie's custody because that's, not going to end well.
Yeah. It's like, we're not done with Charlie. He, typically at the end of a film, it's like they've had this big growth and now they're on the other side. He's still growing quite a bit.
No question.
Yeah. I think, I'm going to throw this out there. Clearly Dustin Hoffman's performance is, amazing. He wins the Oscar for it. It's a big deal. But I personally think Tom Cruise's performance is really fantastic here and is probably the harder role. Like you mentioned, it's kind of a one note Dustin Hoffman. Like he just has to kind of say the same thing. And he's doing a great job. Not every actor can do that. But at the end of the day, he's sort of just doing the Rain Man character. Tom Cruise has at the beginning, he's like so obnoxious. Like I cannot stand this guy. And especially when he's dealing with the lawyer and he's just like, angry about the money. And throughout the whole first half of the film, he's just like constantly annoyed, constantly shouting. He's just like the biggest, most annoying yuppie on planet Earth. And then you mentioned like he kind of comes around and becomes really sympathetic. I would argue that like by the time they get to the casino and their card counting, you're like, oh, this feels kind of icky. But then like it really, really seamlessly morphs into this amazing, touching moments. Oh, yeah. And I think that is sort of the change where we start to see Charlie as this really sympathetic character. And that's really hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, like the whole idea of like the beds, right? Like, so Raymond, really needs to have his bed right by the window because that's how he has it set up in his room at home. And so when he's taken away, they like in the first hotel they stay by, like he pushes it over begrudgingly and he doesn't, but by the time they get to the casino, like you're saying, he's already like set it up beforehand and like he's put some thought into it. And it's like those little things. It's like a nice touch that he's thinking about someone other than himself. And I thought that was like pretty touching for a douchebag like Charlie to do something like that, who's like so self-involved, to then like think about his brother in that kind of way. Yeah.
You see a lot of it in his interaction with his girlfriend too. I think like typically she would have been a throwaway character, but I think she's really pivotal to like his arc, because in the beginning, he's just so dismissive of her. It's so fantastic the way they set this up, where like he's got this big business deal going on. What's his business? He's like trying to like smuggle cars? Lamborghinis into the country. Yeah,
he imports cars, but they're like on the gray market. So they're like maybe like questionably acquired.
Yeah. It's super weird. But anyways, he's doing this big deal, and he's like, they're supposed to go on vacation, and they're driving in the car, and she's like, why won't you talk to me? It's been like 2 hours and you haven't said anything. So he's very clearly set up as this guy who like doesn't care about anyone else. And it's like, you know, really obviously set up that like now he's going to have to start caring about people. But the girlfriend character is super interesting and really, really helps sort of like illustrate Charlie's journey, because you could imagine that like if she wasn't in this, it's really just Charlie and Raymond together and sort of his turn of character in his dealings with Raymond. But when you add in the girlfriend character, it's like his character is starting to change, because at the beginning of the movie, he's so obnoxious and despicable that she ends up leaving. She's like, what you're doing is weird and exploitative. And like, I can't believe that you're doing this, and you're doing it for all the wrong reasons. And he's trying to use all the schmaltzy lines on her that he's using on everyone else, and it's not working. So she ends up leaving. By the end of the movie, when she comes back, it's very clear that things have changed, and his interactions with her are so much better. Like he really is starting to move into a territory where he is actually starting to be aware of other people, care about them, and actively try to make them happy.
Yeah, maybe that's why this is so much more successful than the later films that try to tell the same story, because we can see Charlie's growth in his relationship with his girlfriend because of his relationship with his brother. And his relationship with his brother doesn't need to be like the ending. And the girlfriend character, because that's not realistic. And that's where we would feel like super cheeseballs. But because the girlfriend is there, it's like that's how we're able to see a realistic amount of human growth. And it's almost like the brother is able to make that happen, but we don't see a change in the relationship with the brother, because that would probably never happen.
Sure.
In real life.
Yeah. I like, so Susanna, I like that she's sort of, her being Italian kind of like adds an extra layer to it, of just like, she doesn't take shit from people, and she certainly doesn't take shit from
She's
Charlie.
Emotional. She likes pizza.
I just like love that she gives it to him, where it is like Charlie's like this alpha dude, and she kind of like puts him in his place. Initially, like you said at the beginning, she's kind of, when we're first introduced to her, you think she's just like the secretary, but then he's like, all right, we're going to Palm Springs. And then she's like giving him a hard time in the car, like, can you talk to me? Like, what's going on? Why aren't you saying anything? And then later on, she's very supportive of Raymond, but she does sort of stick up for Raymond and sort of push Charlie a bit, which I feel like, she's almost more than just arm candy, which is like you were saying, Emily, how like sometimes the female, co-star of someone like this, may just, I'll be the caregiver. She is a caregiver, but she's also someone who advocate for him. And I really thought that was kind of refreshing.
She really seems like a fully fledged character with real personality. I wouldn't like, even where she can't seem to really like push Tom Cruise. It seems to me like her character clearly doesn't have the ability to push Tom Cruise towards the person that he needs to be, let's say. But she's able to see through his shit right away, and she calls him out on it constantly. And I think that is an important aspect of a character that we don't see very often, right? And so she's able to see him for who he truly is in the beginning. And so by the end, when she appears, we know she has this ability to see through who he actually is. And so she knows that he's being genuine. And so she sort of is like this, I don't know, Rosetta Stone for the audience, that like, oh, okay, if she believes him, then we believe him.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think that, to your point, Daniel, that his or her role usually in a lesser film is like the caregiver, but in a way that is equated with self-sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, I can totally fix you. I'll just make the relationship better. Oh, I'll fix your relationship with your brother. And that's not what she does at all. She's like, this is bullshit. I'm not doing it. And she leaves. And she also shows Charlie, like, your brother is a human being and there's value that you can find in your relationship with him. It might not be what you had expected, but he is valuable as a human. And here's the way that I find value in him and have an experience with him. Like, we have something just between us, like, because we can have a human relationship. And she teaches him that. And it has nothing to do with her like sacrificing herself or trying to solve everything, which is really wonderful because we do not see a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, she's super warm. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's like such a necessary component to his growth because, you know, Tom Cruise's character kind of that growth starts to happen when he starts to see him as a person when, you know, the sort of, we were talking about the sort of mathematical prowess sort of comes out when he drops the, you know, when the woman drops the toothpicks and he says, you know, 246 and kind of counts them immediately. And like, you get this sort of spark of, what can I do with this mathematical genius? And obviously that translates to the iconic, you know, Vegas sequence because it's, you know, how can I win big with this guy? How can I teach him how to count cards? But I think the emotional component of that, you know, beyond just this guy's a capable person, but also he's, you know, a sensitive person and should be treated sensitively. You know, it's obviously born out of, you know, the sequences where they talk about their past and when Charlie discovers that, you know, he was the Rain Man that used to sing to him. But I think it's also like completely born out of that relationship that he has with, you know, Susanna, because like you were saying, like she shows him that, you know, this person is also an emotional, sensitive person that should be cared for, you know, and not, I mean, borderline abused, like which is kind of the way that Charlie treats him in the beginning.
Yeah,
absolutely. How do you guys feel about Tom Cruise? Are we Tom Cruise fans? I guess 80s Tom Cruise is very distinct from like 2000s Tom's Cruise because this is like peak Cruise. I think he's coming off Top Gun, Cocktail. Right. Like he is on a like straight arrow 90-degree upward trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of like Tom Cruise. Like Magnolia is one of my favorite films, and so so him in that
playing himself.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know that role is amazing. There's a lot of, you know, what's that called? Live, Die, Repeat. Tomorrow? No.
I never saw that.
Tomorrow.
I never saw that.
Edge of Tomorrow. That's what it was. Yeah, that one's a good one. I dig his performances. I'm, you know, the Mission Impossible stuff like that, more recent stuff. I could do without it. I don't know.
I gotta tell you though, I went to a couple of those because of either like group things. I don't remember, you know, like a team building thing where it's like a safe movie to pick for work. And it wasn't bad. I didn't hate it. I was like, this is reasonably entertaining. You know, like Lethal Weapon, where you're like, okay, I'm here for this. Yeah.
I think first and foremost, I mean, he is like one of, if not the greatest movie star of all time, you know, and what that means, the sort of charismatic action star. And that's kind of, and in a way I've almost dismissed him like that because I'm like, he is just like this ball of charisma. And I've seen a lot of the late stuff. I mean, I just saw Top Gun Maverick and he's just running that movie as like the most charismatic guy in the world. But I think in my mind, that kind of has me dismiss him as a little bit of like a deep kind of thoughtful actor because that's just not where he's operating. And for most of his movies, I don't think he needs to be, but I think in Rain Man, I mean, at least for me, it was seeing him in a slightly different light. And it was like all of a sudden like, oh, this guy actually can show some depth and he can leverage, I think, that same action star charisma, you know, fast talking yuppiness, so to speak, into like growth and depth. And like we said, you know, it's not like the full kind of, you know, surface level, just like flip around where all of a sudden he's this incredible guy. Like he really, by the end of the film, comes off as someone who's still kind of stuck in some of his ways, but is also in the process of learning and is probably going to continue to, you know, reform himself. And that, you know, to get that balance where you're kind of like in that in between state, like to me, that was born out of his acting. And I thought that was actually surprisingly impressive.
Yeah. The only one I can think of is maybe Jerry Maguire, where he's kind of doing a similar type of character arc where it's like maybe a true drama. The Color of Money, the pool one with Paul Newman is kind of similar. But then after that, it's just like he just becomes the action star guy. You know what I think really messed him up? I think working with Kubrick messed him up. When he did that Nicole Kidman, Eyes Wide Shut, it was all over after that. Like then it's like full blown Scientology Tom Cruise jumping up and down on Oprah's couch, like just I need to do all my stunts where like I drive a motorcycle out of a helicopter, and like he just went crazy after that.
It became less about the acting after that. It was what's the craziest stunt and how can I just be in a big movie where, stuff is kind of moving around me. That's what all those late movies are.
Lots of this actor arc that we can point to.
Yeah.
Who's the recent guy that I loved in Parks and Rec that's awful now?
Chris Pratt.
Yes.
Chris Pratt, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seattle local, I think.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but he also did things like A Few Good Men. I'm just looking at his IMDb page now.
I am too, Risky Business.
What's the Vietnam one?
Born on the 4th of July?
Yep,
is that it?
Born on the 4th of July, yeah. So he did
That's right after this. It's the next year.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think he just really becomes the star of the 80s and 90s.
I mean Risky Business is a big one.
Yeah, Risky Business. I mean, he is like the biggest Hollywood icon. Like you mentioned, he really just becomes like a Hollywood movie star.
Male Julia Roberts.
Yeah.
But not that Julia Roberts isn't likable, because I feel like I don't know anything about her personal life, but I feel like in terms of their careers.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think everyone,
she did all the schmaltzy rom-coms that are kind of not great. And he did all the like shitty dude action movies that are not great. It's like the male and female version of the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I personally enjoy the roles that are like a little bit more unique, whereas like these action movies, some of the later ones it could be any of the Chris's, it could be any of the Toms, whatever.
Let's just put all the Chris's in there.
Yeah, I
just start switching them out every couple of hours and see if anyone notices.
Right, exactly.
What's happening?
Well, when are we going to get Tom Cruise in a Marvel movie, I wonder?
Yeah.
I think they're probably filming it now.
Yeah. You think he's too big for one? I wonder. Like
it's going to be like an Angelina Jolie role where he just kind of like shows up in the background and he's like the father character or something. Like, yeah.
Kind of just like walks by. Hey.
The voice of like a weird talking dog or something. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it is interesting his sort of career arc and where he is now. I always wonder like where people like this are going to go. Top Gun, this new Top Gun was pretty big. But I think like Hollywood's different now. And I wonder how much like Hollywood cachet he has, especially with a newer generation. It reminds me of somebody like Paul Newman when I was a kid, where it's like the older people loved the 90s Paul Newman. And it's like, oh, Paul Newman's, I'm like, dude, that guy means nothing to me. But he was such a huge star in a generation before. And so I kind of wonder if Tom Cruise will start, how does he revive his career? Does he start taking chances and make like more Magnolia style movies? He really seemed like the guy that wanted to work with all the big directors. I mean, he's gotten films with all we talk shit on Mission Impossible movies, but every single one of them is directed by these massive directors. He's worked with all of them. And he definitely seemed to be the guy for a while that was choosing these really specific movies. So does he go back to some of that and do some of the more quirky, weird roles?
I'd love to see more of that. Yeah.
Or does he just continue to crank out and turn into like Stallone or somebody like that, or Clint Eastwood, where he just kind of like becomes a caricature of himself, like Schwarzenegger, or he just does straight to Netflix versions of Mission Impossible when they decide to replace him with Jeremy Renner. Maybe he does like a salad dressing like Newman, Newman's Own. That would be amazing. I would love that. He's like, yeah, with every bottle you purchase, 10% goes to Scientology research. Right.
I like the Stallone comparison you made because, one thing about Tom Cruise's career is that he never actually won the Oscar. He was nominated 3 times. And, you joked about him winning for this film, but he wasn't even nominated for this one. Oof. And I think like the Stallone thing, I just think of, him returning to that sort of Rocky character when they did Creed and like kind of making the Oscar push, and probably should have capped his career off with that Oscar win. I know that was a contentious year, but I wonder if Tom Cruise comes back in the next, 10, 15 years and says, let me just go back into the well for one of those, like, let me do Jerry Maguire, the sequel and really make the case for that.
Rain Man 2. What's Dustin Hoffman been doing lately? I mean, let's talk about Dustin Hoffman. He was massive in the 60s and 70s. We talked about The Graduate. After that, it was just straight up for him. Like he made huge movies. The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, All the President's Men, Kramer versus Kramer. These are massive 60s and 70s movies. Wow. And by the 80s, he's doing Tootsie. This movie, Tootsie, won Best Picture. I mean, he's everywhere. So he, to a certain extent, is like the big box office draw. His name is at the top, even though Tom Cruise is still like the massive sort of next generation. You've got the previous generation, next generation kind of thing going on. Then like by the 90s, Dustin Hoffman is just like just where is he? And he's putting out by, the 2000s, he's doing the Meet the Parents 7. And, it's kind of like disappeared into bit roles in like Noah Baumbach movies.
He did Hook. I mean, famously, he was Captain Hook.
That's true. Right after this, he does Hook. But I think this could be a career resurgence for both of them. They could both be the Stallone in this comparison.
Oh, interesting.
They do Rain Man 2, and they both get nominated for Best Actor. I'd love to see it. How do you guys feel about Dustin Hoffman? Are you fans? You mentioned the Jewish side of Dustin Hoffman's life. I don't know that he's, particularly practicing or sort of like outspoken about it, but
he's not. But I think he grew up to Jewish folks in Los Angeles and things like that, and a lot of his roles are like infused with Jewish things. I think lately there's this movie that hopefully we're going to review on our podcast, the Meyerowitz stories that he did with Noah Baumbach, where he plays the father to like Adam Sandler and Ben Stiller, things like that. So it's like a part of, and he's done like a bunch of films over the years, I think, that speak to his sort of Jewish identity connection. But yeah, I think like at the time, like you were saying, he did have like quite a few hits in the 70s and 80s. I'm a big fan. I think he also has like later career, he did like Kung Fu Panda. So like maybe there's a point where people are like, here's a bag of money for 3 days worth of voiceover work. Would you do it? You're like, yeah, I'll do it.
Oh, I think everybody's done that.
Yeah.
Find me someone who hasn't taken that job.
I'm available.
4 great voices right here.
Exactly.
Although from what I've read about Dustin Hoffman, and we kind of talked about it on Tootsie, is that he's like really hard to work with.
Yeah,
he's like controlling. He's kind of a little bit crazy, where he'll just pick fights with people. He's kind of an asshole. He had a reputation around Hollywood by this point, and I think he really likes things a specific way. He's a method actor, which can be kind of annoying for a lot of people. He tends to take over the directing duties and even like script rewriting. There's like some famous stories when he was making things like Marathon Man and Papillon, where he was working with Laurence Olivier. There's a very famous quote where Laurence Olivier, when he found out that he was a method actor and he was going through, Dustin Hoffman's doing all this like stuff to get into character, and Laurence Olivier is like, it's called acting. Just
that's the job.
You don't have to do all this. But there was like certain scenes that he refused to film, and they just like ended up having to pull it from the script because they wanted Dustin Hoffman. And so I think by the time we get to the 90s, I think people were just sick of his shit. They're like, hey man, like you're big, but like there's a new breed of actor and we just don't need you anymore.
It's so funny to me because, what I love about his acting is that he's just so he could be so reserved and internal and very like quiet and thoughtful. And, you don't get the impression that he's this sort of loud personality, big like movie star commanding, but it's so interesting the way his persona, in film is so at odds with just the stories because I had also heard a lot of these stories about how he just like completely just drains people and takes over sets, and just people, hate him after working with him, which is just, it's so not the impression I've gotten from the few films that I've seen him act in.
No, I never would have guessed that.
Yeah.
We had a guest, I don't remember who it was, but we were talking about Tom Cruise. Nope, sorry, Tom Hanks, the other one. So Kevin really doesn't like Tom Hanks, and this guest, she really liked Tom Hanks, and we had a conversation about actors that are not attractive that somehow you think are attractive. And I feel like Dustin Hoffman
that was Eva Walker. Yeah, she had a huge crush on Tom Hanks.
It was Eva Walker. That's who it was.
She loved Tom Hanks. Was like physically attracted to Tom Hanks, and I was like, really? Like,
are there people that you're just like,
it's you and Rita Wilson?
I don't know. He just like, I wouldn't have thought that he was a super diva. He's I think maybe it's that persona that he plays that is more like laid back, and maybe it's because I've seen The Graduate a lot of times, but I feel like there's something attractive about him.
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
Dustin Hoffman,
we talked about The Graduate when he's walking around shirtless. He looks very
Dustin
attractive.
Hoffman. Tom Hanks, I don't get it.
No, Dustin Hoffman, I think that was a story of his early career. He struggled for a long time. He didn't have the look. It's crazy. I was looking up
which is weird because he's very attractive when
Life
he's young.
magazine, after The Graduate came out, Life magazine said if Hoffman's face were his fortune, he'd be committed to a life of poverty. Constantly, everyone was calling him ugly. And I think it's just because he wasn't Paul Newman. Like he wasn't blue-eyed blonde hair. And you got to imagine Rita's
not Aryan enough.
There is this change.
Maybe.
this shift in the 60s where we start getting people like De Niro, but maybe more to a greater extent, Pacino, these actors who like Hollywood sort of categorizes as like too ethnic looking.
Interesting.
These big Hollywood stars. I think on top of that, he's pretty short, although Hollywood has found a way around that in the past.
Yeah, so is Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise.
Yeah, exactly.
I think they both might be shorter than I
That
am.
scene where they're both walking, it's like they're sort of like head to head, you know, in that long shot.
They're both walking on like a pedestal podium, like to keep them above everyone else.
They like only hire short people.
Yeah, you're like, it's funny, we never see their feet.
But I think like Hollywood decided that, you know, he just wasn't attractive enough and he struggled for a really long time. And I think The Graduate was just this lucky, massive break for him that really opened up a lot of doors. And he kind of was able to find roles for himself. And he worked really, really hard to find different kinds of roles because what he's doing in The Graduate is so different from Midnight Cowboy. And then he's doing Little Big Man, which is like a favorite of mine, a kind of Western where he's playing a bunch of different characters. So he's really trying to show his range every time he was taking a movie. And I think that it really showed off the fact that he is one of those true actors that can kind of be anyone, so to speak.
Right. It kind of reminds me like weirdly of like Robert Pattinson or like Daniel Radcliffe, who like after, I mean, I know like Dustin Hoffman wasn't in a Harry Potter or Twilight movie of his time, but like sort of they sort of have like the reverse of all these people we were talking about who are like now doing popcorn stuff towards the later part of their career. Whereas like Daniel Radcliffe and Robert Pattinson, who started out doing popcorn movies, are now choosing like Weird Al biopics and like, you know, what is it? Swiss Army, whatever. I don't know, all these like
farting corpse.
Yeah, exactly. Like very bizarre movies, like working with weird artistic directors, but now they have sort of their pick of whatever. And I feel like Hoffman sort of started out doing, Lenny, which is another interesting movie, Bob Fosse movie, kind of, and Kramer versus Kramer. But like every other movie I'm looking at his IMDb, I'm like, wow, like he played a Dick Tracy also, like just a lot of different roles. And I think, you know, having that sort of not being able to be pegged down as like one particular type of actor sort of allows you to kind of be a chameleon. And
I think also if like Hollywood's constantly telling you you're not attractive enough to be a movie star, then he's like, hey man, like it's acting. I don't have to be attractive. Like I'm here to act. Whereas somebody like Tom Cruise is like, he's just beautiful. Like put him in a film and people will go see it. He doesn't even need to be a great performance. Not that Tom Cruise is not a great actor, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's tons of careers that are built on faces for actors that just aren't that great and actresses. And yet some of these people, I think like, you know, Dustin Hoffman maybe felt like he had a chip on his shoulder and he had something to prove. I think the method acting really helped him. It was new at the time and he was able to like really get into character. I think method acting is nowadays is kind of like laughed upon and is sort of like an annoying thing. And it's like a meme that people talk about people like Jared Leto who, you know, do a 10-second Joker film and end up like ruining everyone's lives because they have to get into character. But I think at the time it was sort of new and interesting, and it really helped him sort of like unlock things that he was able to display that other people weren't willing to go that far, or whatever you might want to say. But anyways, one of the great actors for sure, I think. Hopefully he can get back in there and do something a little more interesting. I have a couple of other questions and things I wanted to talk about. First of all, the car. Are you guys car guys? Do you care about this car?
I have a car, and but I did appreciate the Buick and sort of like the I like old cars.
Yeah. It's cool. It's a cool idea, and it really helps sell the sort of road trip idea behind it, you know, because this ostensibly is a road trip movie. And so it's like, you got to have the right car for it. We talked about Thelma and Louise. You got to have the right car for a road trip movie. I don't particularly care about cars either. But I did think it was interesting that after the movie finished, Dustin Hoffman bought the car.
Oh, he did?
And he restored it, and he kept it like in a garage for like 40 years. And he sold it this year, 2022, for $335,000.
Did you read that there was two? Did you say that? Sorry.
There was two. You're right.
And like Barry Levinson bought one because I think they had to rig one to like hold the camera, and then they used one as like a prop car. But it's such a I just love that you have this like really nice old classic car that's like from his past, and now his like present is these like luxury Ferrari, Lamborghini, kind of like American versus Italian. I don't know if there's something.
Yeah, I thought it was really nice.
That is an interesting parallel. I didn't even think about the idea that we start off, the film starts off with these Lamborghinis being dropped down, which is like, that car to me was like the most iconic car of my childhood. Like I remember having toys of that. There was like fruit snacks of that specific car shape was so important.
Is it a Countach? Am I getting it right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'll give it to you. I have no idea.
I'm a girl, and in the 90s, girls didn't like cars.
That's right.
No, that looks right. Yeah, the Lamborghini Countach. Yeah.
I definitely think there's something.
What's that?
I was going to say, just with the car, I think that there's something going on with his past where, there's this big threat. His father won't let him ever drive the car. And that's, the biggest point of their rift. So him kind of going into an industry where he gets to control and move around cars is like,
200%.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Like not the
show you dad.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. If he went to therapy for 3 years, that's a connection he would make.
Yeah. 100%.
100%.
Like his whole character is very reactionary to kind of the past and being separated from his mother and from his family and like always looking for that. And, that's all. And I'll just use that as the point to make that I think the plotting in this movie is like very tight. You were talking about like the car and just like the way that like each beat of the movie kind of progresses and comes back around, and like how they get to, Vegas, which was the one scene that I did know about before I watched the movie. And I was just kind of waiting for them to get there, and just the way it unfolds, like it's just a very tight story. Like none of it felt forced.
Sure. Yeah. The road trip setup, I think, definitely allows for that, and allows like all these stops on the road and like different set pieces for them to like, oh, here's like another conflict. We have to stay at a hotel, but it's raining, and oh, we have to watch Wapners. We have to like barge into this woman's house, and like,
You know what? That puts them kind of on the same level because they're both out of their element. Yeah. It's not in anyone's home territory.
Totally.
I don't know if Charlie's ever out of his element.
Well,
like when he goes to knock on the barn door, he's like, all right, let me do the talking. Here we go.
He doesn't know how to take care of his brother.
Salesman mode.
He keeps like fumbling, trying to care for his brother.
Yeah.
But it's nice to see that, like for him to like have these missteps only towards the end to like have another opportunity to like, by the time like the smoke alarm goes off at the end and he's trying to make Eggo waffles, he's like on it. He's not annoyed. He's just like, all right, I got to get to it. Like, got to knock off this smoke alarm, got to get him his waffles and his juice and whatever. But it does, it's like you said, Harry, it's not a forced way to progress the story along, but it does offer a lot of opportunity to showcase the growth.
And you know what this reminded me of? Raising kids. Like this is exactly what it's like to have a child, like a toddler, where they're just like, their needs need to be met, and you can't be mad at them for it because they're sort of, and to a certain extent, I think like the understanding of autism is that there's a developmental delay. And so like in a lot of ways, they are childlike in the way that they perceive the world. And so like, clearly the parallel was obviously already there, but just like reminded me so much of dealings with my kids where it's like, you can't leave them alone at all for any amount of time. They're constantly needing attention. They're just like super picky about everything all the time. They always have these needs, and there isn't the same like kind of like understanding for your needs. Right. And so it just really, really made me think about being a parent. It sort of stressed me out to a certain extent. Like, oh my God, this is what my day is like every single day.
I was thinking about that too, because my son is 8 months old and he like wants to stand, but physically can't. And so he's constantly clawing at me. And I always am like thinking about how he's an accidental asshole. Like he pushes into my throat to where I can't breathe all the time.
Rain Man 2, accidental asshole.
But it is kind of like that. Like they just don't know. And so it's like, you want to get frustrated, but you keep telling yourself like, okay, he's just a baby. He's being an accidental asshole and it's not about me. And that's totally what it is like, he's not trying to be an asshole. He's being accidentally an asshole. It's not an intentional thing. He's just like existing in the world. And that's how it happens to turn out to Tom Cruise,
That reminds me of the scene when they're sort of in the phone booth and he's farting in there, and like that, and it's exactly like
asshole.
That's all that's happening. Like you kind of like, you understand why, Charlie is so upset, but also you can't really blame Raymond. Like,
no, it came out
accidental.
Yeah. But just all the stuff with like The fish sticks. Oh no, it's gotta be 8 fish sticks. Only have 4 here. It's like that is a sentence that I have heard in my actual life. And I knew what to do from watching this movie. I just chop them in half.
And now you have twice as many.
Except
there
he made the mistake of showing him what he was doing. What you got to do is you got to pull the plate away so they don't know, chop them, and then give them the plate back. Here we go. Here's 8. Wow, it's all brand new.
I literally did that this evening where I was like giving my daughter some yogurt, and like often I'll open the yogurt and I'll give her the whole one, and then I'll end up with like half uneaten. Mm-hmm. So I like poured half into another container, gave her half the yogurt first, and then she finished it. And then I gave her more. I thought that was a pretty cool, pretty slick move of me over here. But
3 dad hacks right here.
I just pat myself on the back for that. You know,
I love it.
Since you can't, but
come to us for your parenting advice.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but definitely, I think it is a realistic portrayal of caregiving, and I think that sort of to sum up everything we've talking about, I think that is what this film is about. Which might not, to Harry, to kind of your point of like knowing a lot about the film, I gotta imagine that's not the stuff that's getting out into the sort of like public consciousness. And then when you watch it, that's the stuff that you kind of like are taken away with, like, wow, okay, I'm understanding Tom Cruise's character arc and sort of like how difficult it is to be a caregiver. Because I think that's the point of the doctor character as well, is the doctor isn't like, he's not like, hey, we need this money for the hospital. He's like, you don't understand what you're trying to get into. Like, I get that you hated your dad. I get that you just found out you had a brother, but like, this is hard. Like, he has needs that you might, and it's not about like, you can't meet his needs. It's that his needs are constant and that you might not have the time. And I think that's a lot about what being a parent is as well.
Well, and they're unchanging, because at some point your kids will be able to care for themselves. Mm-hmm. But it's like, if he were to get custody or conservatorship over his brother, he would need to care for him for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Full-time care. That's a lot of people that are not professional caregivers are not equipped to do that.
Yeah.
It's exhausting. It's draining. Yeah. I mean, I think, it's tough. And I can't imagine, it's like, it's a hard thing. And I think, it's interesting too. I thought there's no like real villain in this movie, right?
There's not. Yeah.
Probably the EPA.
Oh, true.
Just let him have his cars. Come on. He needs the money.
But it's like, it's nice that like the institute where he's staying, where Raymond is staying, like there's no like evil doctor who's going to like take his millions of dollars and like run away to Cabo or whatever. They're all looking after Raymond and what's best in his best interest. I almost feel like Charlie is sort of the villain at the beginning, but then he sort of turns to this more sympathetic character. But there is conflict even without there being like a clear enemy in this film, which is I thought was kind of a cool move.
Yeah, that is a good point. I didn't think about that.
And this whole conversation is even making me sympathetic to their father, who like in the beginning of the movie, I mean, he's like, he's like the real jerk in the movie. And you can tell he never showed love to Charlie and he's awful. But you kind of get the sense that like, after their mother died, when, they had the sort of accident with the hot water, right? Because we kind of learned that that's why, Raymond was kind of rehomed. And you get the sense that he really was just being very protective over Charlie. And I'm sure that doesn't justify all of the, absence he did. And we don't get enough of the characterization for me to really say any of this. I'm kind of just, reading all this into the few lines we get about the father. But there is some sympathy for, him trying to protect his, children and just being dealt, a very difficult hand, losing his wife, having a son who's, autistic like this, and just, again, a little bit of sympathy. I'm not sure. It still seems like he was a very distant father, and it's really just sad on both sides that they kind of really don't have a relationship for the last, 20 years of the father's life. But at least you're getting some sympathy from me, just because this is a difficult situation.
I mean, though, Tom Cruise states like, he wouldn't let me drive the car, so I left. I'm like, and you didn't talk to him for like 20 years. I'm like, that doesn't seem like justified, So it's like, maybe the father wasn't back. Maybe it's you, Charlie. It's like
the father, stole his car.
Right, the way the father handles it, right? He like doesn't pay his bail and makes him sleep in jail. Like it's definitely tough love. It's very harsh. But also, I agree with you. You stole the car. He didn't want you to get into like an accident. He cared about the car. Like, I'm kind of on both sides right now.
feels like a dad move. In what time would that have been? The 70s or something? You'd be like, oh, he's a man. Let him sleep it out in jail. Like it feels like just tough it up kind of move. I don't know. Not that it's okay, but I agree with you. I kind of do feel for the dad.
What do these parents look like? I was thinking about this. Like, what do the mom and dad look like that they produced a Dustin Hoffman and a Tom Cruise? Very interesting looking folks.
Well, they were probably both short, right? We can conclude that.
Good call. Good call.
Well played. I love that. All right, you guys, we've been talking about it to death. Does anyone have any last minute thoughts before we kind of wrap it up and rate it? Oh, I actually do have one last thought. One of the kind of like key pivotal scenes in the movie is they're supposed to fly back, and then Raymond says like, I can't go on a fly. And he starts like listing off all the crash statistics for all the airplanes. Mm-hmm. First of all, I just want to say like how amazing flying in the 80s would have been when like you just show up at the airport and you just pick an airline that they all go to all of the cities, where nowadays you're like, please God, please, somebody is flying to Seattle. Oh my God, they're flying to Seattle. And then it's like 4 a.m. You're like, well, that's the only flight. I guess I'm taking it. Right. It's $1,000. Sure. Take my money. And you're going to squeeze me into a can. But anyways, he was accurate. Qantas Airlines has not had a crash of a commercial flight. Not only that, but the record is sterling to this day.
Qantas
crash. Yeah. So if you're flying to Australia, they got you covered. And the airlines, when they would show this movie, Rain Man, on the flight, they actually edited out that scene because they didn't want people sitting in the seat being like, but I'm on a Delta flight.
Right, exactly.
And so they edited out. The only airline that did not edit out, Qantas. Of course, because they were like, hey, just FYI, just want to let you know, no crashes. Just ask Rain Man.
Nice.
Amazing. Love that. Oh, wait. And second, sort of like final thought was, we recently talked about Good Will Hunting, and I'm so surprised after watching this movie that they didn't do the card counting thing in Good Will Hunting. You think that like a bunch of Boston Southie shitheads would have been like, we definitely need to go to Vegas and like, I guess Atlantic City and like count cards, because this guy's like a mathematical genius. It's about like memorization, about like what's come out of the deck already, and then you start sort of like memorizing what's left.
Yeah. I thought it was a photographic memory thing and not a math thing, but maybe it is a math thing.
But remember, that's like what he has. We talked about this in Good Will Hunting. Remember, he's like, oh, you read this book on page 86. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Maybe that's Rounders. Maybe like Rounders is actually.
I was going to say Rounders must be the sequel, the spiritual sequel to Good Will Hunting and Rain Man.
All right, guys. Here on the Deadbeat Film Society, we do not believe on traditional rating systems because, one man's thumbs up is another man's thumbs down. Opinions are subjective is what I'm trying to say. So we kind of make it up. So the film rating for today, the film Rain Man from the year 1988. Let's rate it. We just mentioned the card counting. So my rating system is this: 1 for bad, 2 for good. How are you guys going to rate it? 1 for bad or 2 for good? Let's start with Emily.
2 for good.
2 for good?
Because I'd watch it again. I don't watch a lot of things twice. So I'm going 2 for good, except for Seinfeld. And it's not twice. It's like 300 times. So 2 for good is really okay. I think
good on you.
I was like, you have to hold out on that.
Talk about Jews on film, though.
I know. I feel like I'm a bad Jew.
No, you can be whoever you want to be.
Yeah.
But it's like required reading at this point.
But I've seen enough Seinfeld to make up for it. So let's just,
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Send the questions my way.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Could you just, what's the soup Nazi?
Yeah. You're like, let me call Emily. Hold on.
Yeah. All right, Daniel, 1 for bad or 2 for good?
I'm going 2 for good. Yeah. I really enjoyed this movie, and like, thinking about the time and contextualizing a lot of it, and even if there was some initial backlash eventually to the film, like the way that the autism was portrayed as this like superpower or this magical ability to count toothpicks and cards and all that kind of stuff. I think, you're talking about like the donations that were made for autism awareness and things like that. Overall, I thought it was like a terrific performance by everyone involved. It's just like it's a good movie. It's not too sweet. I'm going 2 for good. Yeah.
All right, Harry, 2, 1. Which one?
2 for good, for sure. Like I said, I had a very, fixed expectation for what this movie would be before I saw it. And even while I was watching it, was just kind of waiting for the turn, and just like the depth, the nuance, the way that they kind of handled this question of like Charlie's growth. I just, everything I've said over the last hour plus, like Definitely a 2.
Oof, I got to swallow. Sorry. I had to clear my throat. I am choked up for how much I love this movie. I'm also going to go 2 for good. Of course, definitely going to go 2 for good. Me and my sister watched this movie all the time as kids, and we used to do Rain Man impressions all the time. All the time. We used to always say, of course, definitely time for Wapner. Of course, 3 minutes of Wapner. Kmart sucks. We used to say that a lot. We definitely used to say all of the quotes from this movie. And so I love it. It's a big part of my childhood. I feel like this is one of those movies that was on TV a lot. It was kind of like part of the, that classic TV lineup that you just turn on a random channel.
I was watching Seinfeld when I was like 9.
Right. It's a pretty clean movie. I mean, there's that sort of like alluded to sex scene, but there's no nudity.
Right.
Yeah.
That is an amazing sex scene though, where he's like, oh man. Don't mind him. He's just answering a question from an hour ago. Oh, man, it's great. Okay. Now that we've rated it, we've talked about it. Let's do some recommendations. For those that just saw Rain Man for the first time, like Harry, or have seen it a million times like me, what do you guys recommend that they check out next? Daniel, do you want to go first since you kind of already tipped your hand?
Well, I could go with a different recommendation, but I'll
do both.
Okay, so I'll plug
Remind
it
us
again.
of the one and then do a new one.
So it's a show on Amazon called As We See It, and it's just a story about three people who have autism and live in like a group home in Los Angeles, and just sort of their day to day. One of them works at a startup and he gets like fired like right away, and then another one, is he's at home, and then another person, she works at like a fast food restaurant. So it's one season. It's a pretty low stakes commitment. One of the stars is Rick Glassman. He has like a really funny podcast that I enjoy called Take Your Shoes Off. And he talks a lot about the making of the show on his podcast. And, he was recently diagnosed with autism like later in life. And this was like a recent discovery. So kind of hearing his journey on the podcast and then kind of like watching the show, it's kind of like a nice pairing. So I think that's sort of like
scripted or reality.
Oh, no, it's a scripted show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's kind of, I would feel like it's sort of the next evolution of a Rain Man kind of situation, where it's like, rather than see like an accomplished actor portray someone with autism, these are like actually, people who are on the spectrum playing people on the spectrum. So it's kind of like authentic casting. So I'd recommend that one. Yeah.
Cool. And then did you have another one for us?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think Lenny is a fun one. I'm a big fan of like stand-up comedy and things like that. And so this was a movie from 1974 directed by Bob Fosse, where Dustin Hoffman played the comedian Lenny Bruce, a member of the tribe, a Jew, who, had a kind of very edgy comedian. He was portrayed in like Miss Maisel as this like, he had a role in there, or his character was portrayed in Miss Maisel, but Lenny, the movie, is like this sort of black and white film, but it's an interesting Dustin Hoffman performance. So those will be my recommendations. Sorry for double dipping.
No, that's okay. I've never seen it, and I've been interested in watching it. And like the Dustin Hoffman's greatest hits are so massive that it kind of gets buried. Any other actor that would have probably been in their top 2. So I've never actually seen it before. I know that film in particular had a very troubled history, sort of like its creation, and like really drained Bob Fosse. But cool. I'll check it out. All right, Harry, what's your recommendation?
So I'm going to go with The Rehearsal, the new HBO show that we were talking about earlier, Emily. And I'm partly recommending it because you brought it up and made a connection, and this is just an excuse for me to recommend what I thought was just such a fascinating show and experiment.
Yeah.
But the more I thought about it, the more it really lines up. I mean, first of all, and this will make sense to someone who's seen the show, or for everyone who's listening to this who hopefully checks it out, but the show's all about method acting, right? That's a huge part of it. And we were talking about Dustin Hoffman, and going through that method acting and the kind of toll that, what that sort of taxes out of the people around you. But the show is actually also about like custody and what it means to raise kids, and learning what it means to take care of someone, and just the dynamics of like a big part of Nathan's character. And it's a complicated show because it's run by this guy, Nathan Fielder, and he's both playing him like a character version of himself, but also kind of himself. And, he struggles with working through emotions and connecting with other people, and like he does these rehearsals to create connection. And I'm not going to go through the whole show because it's very complicated, and watching it will do, much more than I can explain. But I actually found a couple of connections to this movie, and, hopefully people will be motivated to check it out because it's a great show.
Nice. Emily did text me about it the other day, and she was like, "You got to watch this show." So
I was like, I don't know how to explain
That's
this. I
two.
think it's the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
It's impossible to explain. Whatever you think it is, based on what I just
Yeah.
said, like it's none of that. and
Unless
all
you've
of that.
seen Nathan For You, and then I feel like you kind of have an idea.
You get
but
like a
not
start.
even.
It's like an entry point. Exactly.
Yeah.
But this show
Very
is
weird.
wild.
Emily, what's your recommendation?
Okay, I'm going to recommend another critically acclaimed film. Actually, came out a week before Rain Man, so maybe inspired a little bit about two brothers who didn't know that the other existed. It's called Twins. It stars Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. It has it's in the 40s on Rotten Tomatoes, but I really love it. It's definitely questionable. This storyline is not great, but basically Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger are twin brothers. There is this genetic experiment where they try to make a super baby with 5 different male or men semen, and one of the babies is Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then there's this twin that's created but doesn't get the full DNA somehow, which feels really offensive, but it's Danny DeVito and he got paid for this movie. So I'm thinking he was okay with it. They don't know that the other exists. The mom doesn't know that the twins survived. It's fantastic. It's basically Rain Man, but a week earlier. It made $216 million.
Oh, see, so it's right on the tails of Rain Man.
They wear
a huge movie.
Hawaiian shirts. It's incredible. There's a lot of khaki. You're going to want to watch it. I'm going to recommend Twins.
Good suits on the poster of that.
Yeah.
And then you have the suits in Rain Man. I mean, there's that connection.
That's it. Yes, you're right. It's basically the same movie.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like at least it's a good interpretation of what was pop culture movies in the 80s. What was a typical Hollywood movie in 88? And you compare that to Rain Man, I think it would only sort of elevate how great Rain Man really is.
Yeah, for real. But it's also, when you're like, this is horrible, but I love it.
Yeah, totally.
Twins.
Yeah. Cool. My recommendation is kind of similar. It came out the year after Rain Man, and it's called The Wizard. In 1989, it stars Fred Savage from what's the show that he was on?
The Wonder Years.
The Wonder Years. Fred Savage from The Wonder Years. It has Jenny Lewis from indie darling Jenny Lewis, singer-songwriter Rilo Kiley, and Christian Slater. And it's about Fred Savage's brother is so he has I think what would be described as PTSD. Their sister died. I think she drowned or something. And so his younger brother kind of goes into a mute mode and sort of is displaying characteristics, I would say, of autistic savant. And it seems to have this crazy savant magical ability at playing Nintendo. And so Fred Savage takes him on this journey across America to compete in, I think it's Las Vegas, in this giant Nintendo world championship. And it's kind of amazing and kind of a great interpretation of sort of cult films from the 80s and 80s pop culture, true 80s pop culture, but also maybe the earliest example of a Rain Man derivation or copycat, because it's made the next year. But it's Rain Man for kids. And I also loved this movie and watched it a ton when I was a kid. It was the first world premiere of Super Mario Brothers 3. It kind of was built just to, they were okay, we got this game coming out. It's gonna be the biggest game in the world. We need to make a movie to promote it, or as if nobody was going to buy a Mario game, but whatever.
I wanted a Power Glove so badly.
Yes, the Power Glove was very big in it, where they're meet this asshole kid who's going to defeat them because he's got the Power Glove. But it's I'm sorry, did you not realize that my brother is an autistic savant?
Is that just Tommy, but with video games?
Tommy.
Oh, good
from The Who.
Yeah, no,
because he's a pinball wizard.
Yeah, totally. So the guy that made it was I want to make Tommy, but for a new generation.
Yeah,
totally. Absolutely.
Okay.
Because he was we need to promote.
I was I've seen this, but with Roger Daltrey.
Here's how. Yeah. Oh man, the deaf, dumb, and blind kid sure plays a mean Super Mario Bros. 3. Spoiler alert: he wins. So it's definitely that feel good 80s schmaltz.
Right.
But man, it's for kids, and it was fun, and Fred Savage is in it. So anyways, do it up. The Wizard, 1989. You guys, this was awesome. Thank you so much. This was a really fun episode and discussion about.
I
Thank you
really
for
liked
having
this
us.
movie.
Yeah, it was
So
great.
honored.
Will you guys tell us about your podcast? Tell the listeners about what you got coming up.
Sure. We so our podcast is called Jews on Film. I host it with my co-host here, Harry. Recent episodes have included Clockwork Orange, David Mamet's Homicide, Coen Brothers, A Serious Man, but we've also done things like Uncut Gems, some of the classics like Yentl, Blazing Saddles, Frisco Kid, things like that. And so,
have you done, what was the Babs movie we talked about, Emily? Where she's like,
it was the Fanny Bryce one
in the Jewish.
Funny Girl.
Funny Girl.
Funny Girl.
Yeah, have you done Funny Girl?
I
have not
remembered
yet.
Fanny Bryce, but I
Recommend.
couldn't remember Funny Girl. Yes, it was great. It's like there were a lot of movies from that time period where they're like, it'll be 4 hours long and we'll show every minute of her life.
Yeah,
and you're
totally,
like, this is aggressive.
And
But
also, it's
very
like
good.
Barbara Streisand's in it. Well, of course, we have to make sure that everyone knows she's Jewish. Otherwise, they'll be like, why is she in this movie?
Right.
It's very like, on the nose and kind of on the nose, so to speak. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
That's all good. You want to? Okay. I was just going to say, I think, typically we look at a film. Sometimes they're very explicitly Jewish, like a Funny Girl or a Yentl, things like that. Sometimes they're less so, like with this Clockwork Orange episode. We talked to a professor, a film professor in Wales, who has devoted his later, his career now to discussing like Kubrick and Kubrick was Jewish, and some of his films are explicitly. I don't know. I mean, none of them are explicitly Jewish, but like we kind of like dig deep and find some of the aspects of these films that are, that have some Jewish elements, and sometimes we stretch quite a bit to make those things happen. But it's a fun journey.
Awesome.
Harry, anything to add? Did I miss anything?
No, you pretty much got it. The exercises, it's just a fun podcast we do. We do, like Daniel said, a movie of the week, and we just unpack and rate the film on its Jewishness. We don't make up a new
Nice.
rating system each week. We have a fixed one. We rate sort of Jewish stars, talk about the content, crew, cast, themes, and all that stuff. But yeah, we just have fun with it. Some of them are real stretches, and some of them are explicitly Jewish movies. And we're open to suggestions. If anyone, I don't know if you guys take if you guys get mail or anything and could just forward us suggestions that any of your fans might have.
Send in your top 5 Jewish films. Or films that you like you mentioned. Here's an interesting one that I think you guys might dig, although it's a tough watch. One of our most popular episodes that we talked about was The Holy Mountain, which is like this like nut job movie by this guy Alejandro Jodorowsky, and it's like this art film. But there's a lot of religious iconography throughout the film, but I think there's a lot of like specifically Jewish iconography and like a lot of it's like, deep mysticism and stuff that he's sort of diving into, but could be interesting. And also
add it to the list.
I believe his parents were survivors, and he's got an interesting relationship with Judaism, but I would definitely check out, I listened to a podcast about Topo, his other movie. And after hearing that, I'm like, oh, I definitely want to watch one of his movies. But
yeah.
I really liked Holy Mountain. There's a lot of penises in it, so I'm just throwing that out there. But it's good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's tough to watch. It's tough to understand, but it's interesting. It's super interesting. Jodorowsky is a super interesting figure in sort of like art house filmmaking. Anyways, my suggestion, if you got suggestions, you can send them to either them or us, DebbieFilmSite@gmail.com, and we'll forward them on. So check it out. We'll drop a link in the show notes so people can check it out. Jews on Film. Go and subscribe on iTunes.
Thanks.
Thank you again, you guys. This was great.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
So much.
This podcast started out as a radio show. Emily and I were DJs in Chicago. We played punk and heavy metal. Our show was called Deadbeat. That's why it's Debbie Film Society. So it's sort of like a nod to our roots. I like to recommend a song. The song I'm going to recommend today is by a very famous band you may have heard of called Black Flag. And the song is called Nervous Breakdown. Because that's kind of like what Rayman is having constantly throughout this film. And I was having when I was reminiscing about having to deal with my children. So go listen to Black Flag Nervous Breakdown. It's maybe controversially my favorite vocalist of the Black Flag lineup, Keith Morris. But anyways, a good punk hardcore classic from the early 70s. Hey, along with that list of films that you think that they should rate, why don't you send us a film that you recommend that we talk about next on this podcast? You can email it deadbeatfilmsociety@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at dbfilmsociety and slide it into the DMs on Instagram at Deadbeat Film Society. If you don't want to follow us on social media, I get it. It's not a big deal, but please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or Spotify or whatever. It's 4 words, Deadbeat Film Society. We've got new episodes coming out every 2 weeks. You're not going to want to miss it because we've got a bunch of great films coming out. That's it for today's meeting of the Deadbeat Film Society. Until next time, goodbye.